Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jeanette Lucas. I'm a partner and head of the London Labour and Employment team here at Squire Patton Boggs. And I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Kim Hodge, who is a partner in our Perth Labour and Employment team. Before we get into the detail, just a few quick housekeeping points. So throughout the webinar, all participants will be in listen-only mode. But if you would like to submit any questions during the course of the webinar, you can do that using the Q&A function and selecting all panelists from the drop-down list. We do have quite a lot to get through today, so I can't promise that we'll be able to take your questions as we run through. But if we can't get to them, then rest assured that we will follow up after the event today and deal with all of those questions together. Just so that you know, we'll also be circulating a copy of the slides and a link to the recording of the webinar once we've finished. So why are we here? Well, obviously, in the UK, we know that the law is changing in October, 26th of October, which is less than a month away now. And it introduces a new mandatory duty on employers to take proactive steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. The context for this is, as we have seen and continue to see, there are numerous examples of sexual harassment in the workplace. And we also know that the vast majority of victims are women, not all of them. Sexual harassment can obviously happen both ways. But another statistic is that, a significant proportion of sexual harassment complaints go unreported. And whilst they're not all workplace context, the thrust behind this new legislation is very much designed to put more pressure on employers to be proactively seeking out and taking active steps to prevent sexual harassment occurring in their own workplaces. The reason Kim is with us as well is that in Australia, they have a very similar proactive duty and have been living with it, I think, is it nearly 2 years now, Kim?
Yeah, that's right, Jan.
And whilst the context in Australia is slightly different in the sense that their health and safety at work legislation is quite a lot more detailed and stringent than we have here, and that sort of is the backdrop for the structure and the approach in Australia, there are nevertheless a lot of learnings I think we can take from the approach that is being taken there. And Kim will talk to us a little bit more about that later. So to start with then, I just wanted to give a very brief refresher in terms of what we mean by sexual harassment, because under the Equality Act, there is a specific test for harassment that is slightly different to the test for harassment on other grounds. And the sort of start point for that is that the unwanted conduct must be of a sexual nature. It does not otherwise need to relate to any of the other protected characteristics that we're all used to dealing with. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just to highlight a few key elements of that, and you can see the definition on the slide there. First and foremost, it has to be unwanted, and by unwanted we mean unwelcome and uninvited, and we also mean unwanted, unwelcome from the point of view of the recipient. That's a subjective point of view, and it doesn't matter whether or not they've objected to it. That does not stop the conduct from being unwelcome, unwanted. In deciding whether or not it was unwelcome, they can take into account the conduct of the worker, including whether or not they did object, but that is not a precondition. And obviously, in some cases, we would expect it to be obvious where conduct is unwanted, just given the nature of the conduct involved. Remember also that a one-off incident can be enough to satisfy the test, so we're not necessarily looking for a pattern of behaviour. The other thing about unwanted conduct is that it doesn't necessarily have to be directed at a particular person. If there is conduct going on in the background, but a person is nonetheless subjected to it, then that can still tick the box as far as the definition of sexual harassment is concerned. We also know that it has to have the purpose or effect of violating the worker's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment for them. And there you see the similarity with the other types of harassment coming back in. And there's plenty of conversation around what's often referred to as the banter defense. Everyone else found it funny. It was only meant as a joke. The reality of it is those sorts of defenses often don't work. Neither does an assertion that you didn't mean to cause offence. That's not going to get you into the clear. I think what we often say now is, even if it might have felt funny at the time, particularly bearing in mind that individuals as well as the employer can be on the hook for harassment claims, it doesn't seem as funny when you're sitting in a tribunal hall trying to explain or explain away your joke. So in terms of sexual nature, well, what do we mean by that? It can include various things such as sexual comments or jokes, obviously propositions, body language, particular looks, particularly suggestive looks, and sending explicit messages or even innuendo. So there are lots of different ways that this can manifest itself. Very quickly, some other points to remember: the intention and awareness of the perpetrator. Again, it doesn't matter. The focus is on the impact of the victim. And so the intention behind it in that case doesn't matter. We've talked about the fact that it can be a one-off incident. And we've also talked about the fact that unwanted conduct doesn't have to be directed at a particular person to amount to harassment. It's also worth bearing in mind that in the context of employment, it includes both employees and workers, and potentially self-employed contractors in certain circumstances. So in terms of your current obligations as an employer, well, you are already vicariously liable for acts of discrimination, harassment and victimisation if those acts are carried out by employees in the course of their employment. And if you are found to be so liable, then obviously there are financial penalties that can follow. As things currently stand, there is already what we often refer to as the statutory defence, which an employer can deploy if they can show that they had previously taken all reasonable steps to prevent their employees from acting in that particular way, i.e. acting in a way that constitutes harassment. And the purpose of that defence is really to demonstrate that a conscientious employer has done as much as it sensibly could to prevent that discrimination occurring. Now, notwithstanding the changes that we see coming in October, this statutory defence will continue to be available to employers. But I have to say that historically, very few employers have been able to rely successfully on that statutory defence. And I think it is worth bearing in mind that from the point of view of the new proactive duty, the expectations in terms of what employers do to prevent harassment happening are absolutely going to be stepped up a notch. Where we find ourselves now in terms of the proactive duty and, in terms of the reasonable steps defence, there's never been a prescriptive list of the minimum steps an employer has to take in order to satisfy that defence, and that it necessarily follows, because whenever you hear the word reasonable being used in a legal context, that's obviously got to take into account the background circumstances. And that will include things like the size of the employer, the resources available to it, and the particular context in which the issue arose. And as far as that is concerned, nothing really is going to change when we start looking at what employers will be expected to do in order to satisfy the new statutory duty to take proactive steps to prevent sexual harassment happening. Now, what we do know is, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, is that there is quite a lot of guidance that has been provided, and the EHRC has already had quite a lot of helpful guidance, but they have they've already updated that. In fact, that came out last week, and it does include a list of recommended steps. And if you fail to comply with those reasonable steps, it's not definitive necessarily, but it's highly likely that it will be much more difficult for an employer to show that they have done what is necessary in order to satisfy that new duty. And in terms of again, that concept of reasonable, it's very much dependent on your workplace and the particular context in which you're operating. But the difference is now in terms of what can happen if you're found not to have complied with that statutory duty. There's still the possibility, of course, for financial compensation. And as is always the case, that will be made up of a number of different elements. So it will be partly financial loss arising if the individual has either claimed constructive dismissal or has been dismissed. It can include compensation for injury to feelings, and in rare cases, aggravated damages or exemplary damages. We've already obviously got the possibility that compensation awarded, and bearing in mind it's uncapped compensation, we've already got the possibility of a 25% uplift where the code of conduct in relation to disciplinary grievance procedures hasn't been followed. But now from 26th of October, the compensation may also be uplifted by 25% if the employer is found to be in breach of this new duty. So there is already a real potentially significant financial implication for not having these steps in place. There may also be a financial penalty paid to the Secretary of State if it's felt that there have been some sort of aggravating features which breach the employee's rights. And the tribunal obviously can make recommendations that you take certain steps to reduce the effect of the issue on a particular claimant. There are other potential heads of claim as well, but I think the other aspect which is worth noting is that the EHRC will also have powers to conduct investigations where it considers that there's been some sort of unlawful act. And it will also have new powers to enforce standalone breaches, even without sexual harassment having taken place. And I think that that is quite an interesting one if we think about the extent to which there is or is not liability for harassment on the part of third parties, because it is very clear from the EHRC guidance that as part of the steps required to be taken by you as an employer to prevent harassment happening, they will expect you to consider the extent to which your employees might be at risk of harassment by third parties, whether that is service providers, whether that is customers in a store, whether that is other contractors that they might have to interact with. If you have people who work on a client's site, the extent to which, again, they may be interacting with employees of a third party. So even though on the face of it, there is no, and well, under the Equality Act, there's no direct claim as such. As I say, the EHRC has still made clear that they will see it within their ambit to be able to act on that. So, other key takeaways and key points for you to bear in mind, and we'll keep coming back to these as we talk about the specifics of it. But as I mentioned, or rather, the starting point is that in order for you to be able to identify and manage the risk of sexual harassment arising in your workplace, a risk assessment is almost inevitably going to be a prerequisite. Indeed, I think the latest guidance from the EHRC has made it pretty clear that if you don't have a risk assessment in place, it's going to be very difficult for you to demonstrate compliance. And we'll talk shortly about what that risk assessment should look like, the extent to which you should be carrying out more than one risk assessment, and also how you manage that process going forward. And that last point is very important because there is no question that this preventative duty is not meant to be a one-off. This isn't something you can do now and then in anticipation of the new legislation and then, put quietly in a box and forget about it. There is absolutely the expectation that you will continue to review the risk assessments in place, that you'll continue to review your policies and procedures, that you will continue to review the training of your employees at various different stages in their careers with you. And so it is absolutely something that you ought to build a clear and consistent framework around now so that you can ensure you have that review mechanism in place moving forward. I've already talked about third-party harassment, and we've also touched on what reasonable does and does not mean. When we first started talking about it, there was a real push for a sort of checklist of things that employers needed to do in order to satisfy this duty. And I think for obvious reasons, that just proved impossible, and the UK government declined to do that. And I think that is self-evident almost. It is very difficult for anyone to provide a prescriptive list because, as I say, it's a bit like a health and safety risk assessment. It very much depends on the context that you're dealing with. And there can be multiple different contexts within your workplace, each of which might need to be handled differently. So that is something that you need to have in mind as well. Okay, so just on that note then, before we get too much into what I think from a UK perspective you'll need to be doing moving forward, I wonder, Kim, if I might hand over to you briefly to talk about the Australian experience and how that's shaping up there.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Look, listening to all your points, I think there is a lot of similarities. As you mentioned at the beginning, the Australian context is really grounded in the safety legislation that we have. And so you call it a preemptive, we call it a proactive duty. And that proactive duty is the same as in safety, and the seriousness of which the Australian government is taking sexual harassment cases and sex discrimination cases is that they're saying it is a safety risk. People can end up injured from all of this, and therefore we're applying a similar standard. And that is, as you just mentioned, Janet, there, that sort of ongoing duty to never drop your guard. And so similar to safety, whether it's the physical slips and trips or whether it's the psychosocial mental health injuries, the sexual harassment legislation now requires that proactive approach from employers to protect their employees effectively in this regard. So that occurred 2 years ago, December 22, the legislation was changed. 1 year ago, the Australian Human Rights Commission, similar to the European one, was given a number of powers, and I believe they will be very similar, but they can be proactive. They conduct investigations, they can issue compliance notices, they can make applications to our federal court. And perhaps one point of difference may be that they can require what's called enforceable undertakings, which is that making the employer commit to certain courses of action to prevent further breaches occurring down the track. And if the employer doesn't abide by those, then they're subject to severe penalties for that. So as the slide says there, and as I'm sure is the case in the UK, we can no longer just be reactive. We can no longer say, "Oh, but we had a policy and we did the training." It's what's next. That's the interesting bit. So very, very similar overall, Janet.
Okay, and do we have any? I think the AHRC have issued some standards. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It might be on the next slide. There we go.
Yeah.
So look, it's very comprehensive. It's over a 100-page guide that the Human Rights Commission has put out to businesses. Now we have the same similar requirements to the UK in that it's businesses are expected to be reasonable in their measures here, but it's also proportionate, and it's proportionate, as you've said, Janet, to the size, the financial resources, the practicality, and obviously similar to the UK. This goes across all industries, and so it started in Australia with the mining industry, which was particularly bad. Which is very remote workplaces. So you need to take into account very remote locations and how does that work. But very briefly, to condense 100 pages down, I'll try and only take a minute here, but what does the Commission recommend? Well, it's very generic, but it gives businesses a guide. And just on a very interesting point, I'll come back to it actually, but it's about the Australian Institute of Company Directors. And they've made a very big point to their members to say that this has to start at the top. It starts with the board and the executives, and guidance number one is around leadership. And they want to see leaders having up-to-date knowledge of what the law requires and what the unlawful conduct is. So we are getting lots of queries from executives and boards on this as to, well, what does this mean? What are we required to do? You then would need to look at the culture. And again, leadership has to foster a proactive culture that supports diversity and a very inclusive culture. They will then look at the knowledge and what does the organisation have around telling employees around safe and respectful behaviour at work. They go into risk management, which you've touched on, Janet, and there's a whole section there around a risk-based approach to preventing breaches. One interesting one, I'm not sure if the UK covers this, but it's a big game changer, is the support and what support is there in place for victims of sexual harassment and discrimination, and that often catches organisations out, and so that does require a bit of planning and preparation. Reporting and responding is critical. Hopefully there's nothing to report, but unless you start asking questions and surveying your workplace, then you're not going to know, but that is a very important ground. And then finally, the monitoring, evaluating and reporting back to the workforce. The Australian Human Rights Commission thinks it's important that there's a feedback loop from the board to the executive to the management to the workers, and that there's a cycle of information around this to increase awareness.
Thanks, Kim. And I think that's really interesting. I mean, we will obviously see the linkage between the AHRC approach and the approach being taken here in a number of different aspects. The interesting one for me is culture, and that's not something that has been called out as being a particular standard here. But of course, I think, and I think the EHRC even expressly recognises this. This whole preventative duty is part of an effort to try and transform workplace culture. You know, so that's where the culture element of it comes in. And certainly, given, you know, recent scandals, etc., it's recognised to be something that is very much still needed as far as sexual harassment is concerned. And I think that from a leadership point of view, and you're absolutely right, the position here will be the same in terms of needing to lead from the top and ensure that they understand the importance and the technical aspects of all of this. But I think increasingly also where you have boards and senior leadership teams who have businesses that have ESG strategies, this clearly forms a central tenet of the people-related aspects of that. So the social, and also now with the proactive duty, the governance aspect of that. Okay, so let's talk a bit more then about what you as an employer needs to be doing to take steps to deal with this new proactive duty. Well, you can see there sort of the 5 key steps, and you can immediately see how they overlap with what Kim was just talking to us about in relation to Australia. But the first step has got to be a risk assessment, and that does not necessarily mean a single risk assessment. I think you have to look very carefully at the different parts of your business and consider in relation to each of them the extent to which there is a risk of sexual harassment occurring. And I think in order to inform your view on that, then there's obviously lots of information that you will have internally in terms of previous complaints. You might have exit interviews, you might have engagement surveys that you've completed, all of which will give you some insight in terms of where the risk might be greatest for you. That doesn't mean that you can ignore other parts of the business, and it may well be in some cases that you need to be thinking about a risk assessment for particular events that you host as employers over the course of a year. We were talking recently to a client who takes all of their employees away for a break for a week, and they're all together, and obviously there's various events, team building events that take place during the course of that week, and there's alcohol available during these events, and clearly that is a context in which these issues can arise. And so considering an event specific risk assessment and how you might mitigate the risks there is an important part of what you would need to be doing in order to tick the box on this aspect of your proactive duty. As I say, I think it is making sure that you are really making use of the information that you have got about where those risks are. But in terms of the approach, we've been asked quite a lot whether or not there is a template for a risk assessment, and there isn't. But I think certainly if you have health and safety functions within your organisations, then the approach that they will take to health and safety risk will be a really useful start point and template for you. There's otherwise no magic to it. It really is just a question of being able to document and demonstrate that you have considered the particular risk factors in the different parts of your business. You've considered the ways in which you might be able to manage or mitigate those risks. And you build into that then a process for monitoring the success of those mitigation factors and continuing to consider the extent to which they might need to be reviewed. So the EHRC do give some quite helpful guidance about some of the factors you should consider. They will obviously vary from business to business. It will depend on the type of work that you do, the type of facilities that you work in, whether or not you're engaging with third parties, which we've touched on before. And they also suggest things like lone working and night working, out of office out of hours working, sorry, customer facing duties, which we've touched on already, workers who are perhaps placed on secondment for a period of time, and who are working away from home. They've also, in their guidance, list factors which they also think will increase the risk of sexual harassment, and that might be elements of the workforce which are particularly gender imbalanced one way or another. As I say, the night working and the expectation that workers will attend social events. So there's quite a lot of factors for you to consider. But I think from my perspective, one of the most important things for you to be really making use of is that intelligence, that information you will have in one way, shape or form around what actually goes on in your workplace and where the risks are greatest. And particularly in the context of the fact that we are, I think, 3 or so weeks away from this new proactive duty taking effect. And I should say that unlike in Australia, where they were given a year to get ready for all of this in terms of a transition period, we have no transition period here. So theoretically, at least, come the 26th of October, if you haven't done what you need to demonstrate compliance with this proactive duty, you are potentially at risk. That doesn't mean, I don't think, that you have to have done everything in the time that is available. If you are slightly behind the curve in terms of risk assessments, then demonstrate that you have focused on where you think the risk is greatest and start there, because that is where ultimately the risk of a claim arising is most likely. And therefore, if you're able to at least demonstrate that you have started to think about what needs to be done there, you've looked at the risks and you are starting to take steps to ensure that those risks are addressed, that is much better than doing nothing at all. Okay, so moving on then, well, I don't know, Kim, is there anything else from an Australia experience in terms of risk assessments that you'd like to add there?
Look, I think, as you said, people are after, one document that will be a silver bullet solution. And look, I've seen plenty of risk assessments for the mining sector is completely irrelevant in the finance sector or another service sector. So as you mentioned, Janet, understand your business and understand where the risks may arise in your business, and you develop your own risk assessment. And I'm not trying to be flippant, but you know your business best, and you know the occupations and how they all work. And I think the other big thing is in Australia, although no one has been prosecuted as yet, there is very little ability now, I think, for employers to say, oh, hold on, I had no understanding that this has changed, because there's so much information out there. And in Australia, it's publicly available, often by the regulator, that you can review that and formulate your own risk assessment. And there's no secret sauce to that. It's just about, as you've touched on, identifying, assessing, controlling and reviewing your measures. So it is similar. Yes, we've had a bit more time to prepare. Yes, it's a similar concept. If you have health and safety people in Australia, they can often help you with that process. But it's also very different to start saying to a board, guess what? You need to actually be across this. It's not something that they've had to really understand. So that does take time. And I think it's there's one message, is to really start that process now. And as you say, Janet, I think any regulator is going to be very unreasonable if they expect you to have the full suite of preventative measures in place on day one. But you will need to show that you have started that process and are making good progress.
Thanks, Kim. So moving on then to training. I mean, I think the reality of it is that without some visible training of your staff, it's going to be next to impossible for you to demonstrate that you have taken the reasonable steps to prevent harassment in the workplace. And I think that no doubt most of you will have some form of harassment training in place already, but I think you need to be thinking about when you last did it. And there's no hard and fast rule necessarily, but I think that this is a good opportunity for you to be looking to refresh that. In particular, to make sure that the training is comprehensive. We've been asked quite a lot whether or not you need specific sexual harassment training, and I don't think that you do. I think you can continue to package this as part of your broader harassment training. But just going back to what I was talking about right at the beginning of the webinar, I think you should include in that a specific section to ensure that people properly understand what sexual harassment is and some of those those distinction points compared to harassment generally. And I think that that is also going to be a very important part of your revised policies going forward. I think that you can decide which form of training you want to roll out. My personal view is that having, as far as possible, some sort of in-person training is much more effective. I think that people, the message around this really lands when there's some conversation around it, where there are some case study examples that really test people's understanding and appreciation of some of the nuances here, and where they might be doing things which could lead to them being caught out in future. I think you must make sure now that you're keeping records of training. So I would expect to think about the training you give on induction, how you capture the people who have had that training, how you record that, making sure that if people miss a session, you follow up with them. And also making sure that if you have staff turnover over a particular period, you're making sure you catch up with that training as you go. In terms of the delivery of the training, we're obviously working with lots of clients to deliver that now. It doesn't necessarily matter whether or not you've had an external provider, but I do think that it helps lend some credibility and to some extent helps create a bit of that fear factor so that people take this seriously and really think about how they behave at work. And I think also you would need to tailor that training to some extent to the different populations. I think one of the most important things to think about here is how you equip your line managers to deal with complaints when they come through, because they're very often the front line for them, or at the very least they're at the front line in terms of hearing about things that might not be quite right. And it's really important that they're confident in being able to deal with that immediately and in the right way, because obviously that first conversation can really set the tone in terms of how this kind of complaint or process progresses. Okay, so following on from that and closely linked to the training piece is your policies and your contracts. Now, again, it's really important for you to take this opportunity to look at your policies and your contracts again, and to make sure that it is current, make sure that it is legally accurate as far as the way it defines harassment, and consider the way that you apply your anti-harassment policies and processes to third parties. Particularly, increasingly we see supplier codes of conduct that include these sorts of expectations, behavioural expectations in them, and I'm sure that many of you will have the same. So all of those need to be considered and reviewed as part of this process. And also, what does it say in your contracts about how harassment will be viewed? You have to be a little bit careful there. You can't necessarily say that all acts of harassment will lead to dismissal, because that may not be the case. And you need to be just a little bit mindful of managing expectations. With all of this as well, in the same way as the risk assessment, you need to be continuing to think about the ways in which, or whether or not, the training and the policies that you have in place are effective. Now, they will no doubt form part of the control measures that you build into your risk assessment, so will be reviewed that way. But I think generally speaking, we're of the view that all of this should be looked at least once annually moving forward, even if that process leads you to conclude that actually we don't need to do anything more at this stage. But it's the fact of having gone through that process, and importantly, recording the fact that you have gone through that process, that is going to be really, really important. And in some cases, and I was talking to another client yesterday, again, where you might already have a very strong health and safety risk management process in place because of the nature of your particular organisation, you may already have a risk assessment review protocol in place, and this is another aspect to add into that. The employee experience, I guess this picks up a little bit in terms of the cultural piece, but importantly, it also picks up on a couple of the elements that Kim talked about, which is how complaints are dealt with and how complaints are escalated in the first place, and how they are managed going forward, but then also ensuring adequate support is in place for your employees. So on that first point, I mentioned near the beginning that one of the difficulties is that we still operate in a world where so many complaints and acts of sexual harassment are not being reported. And I think a really key part of the approach that we need to be taking now is to ensure that employees are very clear about the ways in which they can escalate concerns about sexual harassment, whether that's in relation to themselves or in relation to others. Many employers have confidential helplines or whistleblowing type lines that can be used for escalating these sorts of complaints. But I think it's really important to make sure that your employees know what that process is. In terms of reporting back, there's no obligation to do that here. Obviously, if in response to an individual complaint, you would normally indicate the outcome to the complainant in terms of whether or not their complaint has been upheld. You're not expected to go any further than that in terms of remedial action, whether that's disciplinary action against another employee or otherwise. But I think, to Kim's point, it is very useful for there to be some sort of visible follow-on in the event that there are complaints that are upheld, so that your employees understand and have confidence that the process works and does lead to meaningful change where it needs to. And there are lots of different things that no doubt many of you will already do to try and reiterate that where necessary. I guess that's really sort of the cycle, if you like. The other aspect I'll just touch on in terms of employee experience and support. I think there are a couple of things. I think it is worth considering having individuals within the organisation who are particularly trained in the handling of harassment, especially sexual harassment investigations, because they are of a particularly sensitive nature and require careful handling if your process is to engender that confidence and encourage people to come forward if they have concerns or complaints. So I think that is something that you could usefully consider. And in terms of additional support, you're also thinking about things like your EAP and other things like that, which again should form part of your support structures for those that do raise concerns. So next steps. I think it is important for you all, to the extent that you haven't already, to perhaps look at the EHRC guidance. It isn't a complete story. It isn't a checklist for ensuring compliance. But as I said, what it does give a strong indication of is if you're not doing those things referred to in the guidance, it's going to be quite difficult for you to show that you've done the necessary in order to comply with this proactive duty. As I say, the real key is starting with that risk assessment and really focusing on those areas of the business where you think it is likely to be most risky, and really using the learnings that you have, the information that you have about your organisation to inform that. The last point, of course, is back to that ongoing monitoring and review. I talked about making sure that you have a set regular date and time for that, or not date and time, but a period, so it's looked at least annually. But none of that means that if something else happens within your organisation or part of your organisation during the intervening period, that you shouldn't also act on that. This is very much meant to be an ongoing process and something that you are seen to be responding to and managing as and when these sorts of issues arise. So if you are seeing an upward trend in even low-level behaviour that could ultimately progress into something much more serious, then the expectation will be that you act on that. And obviously there are different ways that you can do that. But I think the key message from me is that you just need to keep that eye on what is going on. You need to understand whether or not the messages that you're getting back, whether it's in terms of complaints or the engagement survey, whatever it might be, that suggests that for whatever reason your training isn't quite hitting the doing what it needs to, or that your policies aren't as clear as they could be. Whatever it might be, just being reactive and making sure that you are taking that on board and using it to improve. Ultimately the aspiration is to minimize. You're never going to be able to eliminate sexual harassment completely, and that is not what the expectation is. It is very much that just requiring you to think a little bit harder than perhaps we have done in the past, in terms of maintaining that focus and continuing to be very proactive in acting on things that for whatever reason don't look or feel right. Kim, is there anything else that we could take from Australia in terms of learnings? Any trends, any sort of issues that are coming up?
Yeah, look, I think in the last few days there was an unfair dismissal case here in Australia, and it involved a big mining company again. Long story short, a employee who'd been with the company for about 40 years, 38 years, since an apprentice, he sexually harassed a couple of young contractors that were on site, and his remarks were deemed to be completely inappropriate. And being a big employer, it terminated him after an investigation. Now, that's exactly what should be done. And I think my point that I'm making here, Janet, is that the Commission found his termination to be unfair. And why? It was because the company cut corners on their process. Normally they would give people a week to respond to allegations. They didn't give that time to this person. He claimed he was unaware that the remarks he made were sexual harassment. And in some ways, being an older employer, a different vintage, for want of a different word, there is this mismatch. And I think the issue is to follow your process and don't cut corners. Because if you have the correct process in place with all of this, you'll get the right outcome in the correct way. So that was one recent case. But I think the other one is that, as you said, interesting, the ability to support your workers. And one interesting point I found was to ask the victim what support they would like. It's something that's a bit different that hasn't really occurred in Australia. But otherwise, Janet, I think, as I said at the beginning, it really starts at the top with the leaders. And when you look at all the criteria that are involved around culture and support and risk management, the leadership of the organisation plays really big role in that.
Yeah, and I think that that is a really good point just to come back to as we wrap up, which is, you know, that if you need to, then I think there's quite an easy case to be made for action to your exco or your board. And, you know, I think it is also worth reminding them that, you know, we've seen some real significant fallout for high profile names and brands where these types of investigations and these types of issues have not been addressed in the right way, or frankly addressed at all in some cases. And that can have a hugely detrimental impact on your reputation, your brand, if you're consumer facing, and in some cases, in relevant cases, on your share price. So, you know, there is a real and compelling cause for action here. And, you know, obviously, not forgetting that individuals can be cited in harassment claims as well, which can make life very uncomfortable indeed. The other point I would just mention very quickly is if you are FCA regulated, we've got the new non-financial misconduct, and it's unquestionable that this kind of behaviour would fall in that kind of category. So there is another layer of complexity and urgency, I think, there. Okay, so that brings our webinar today to a close. So thank you all for participating. If you have any other questions about what you've heard us talk about today, then please do get in touch. As I said, we are working with clients on risk assessments. We are doing lots of training, and we have various menus for training that we can share with you if that would be helpful for you. But if there are any questions, please do send them through either to us or to your normal Squires contact, and we'll ensure that they are answered. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be circulating the slides from the webinar today as well as a recording. So please do keep an eye out for those. So thank you again for joining. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and good luck with your next steps. Thank you.